Welcome back in. It's the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. It's our first episode of April, and it's going to be a month that features us getting back to Beaver Stadium, seeing the Nittany Lions in blue-white game action. Hopefully, many of our listeners, viewers will get a chance to join us in Beaver Stadium in just a few weeks. But we're relatively fresh off the practice field. We had our weekly look at the Nittany Lions on Tuesday. Hopefully by now you're well informed because you subscribe over at lions247.com. We had a practice notebook for offense, a practice notebook for defense. We had several takeaways from commentary with James Franklin, multiple position coaches, multiple players that we spoke with after practice. We have a completely full photo gallery, comprehensive from every angle of the field. And we have a 4-minute video highlights package coming out of that practice as well. If you've missed it over at the site, get over there. If you're not a VIP member, through Spring Ball, 50% off a VIP subscription for a full year at Lions 24/7, or take a look at what we do, $1 for 1 month. I'm pretty confident you'll stick around beyond that first month. We're going to take a look later in this episode about what's going on with Penn State's quarterback recruiting. There's some interesting developments in the 2026 class. Penn State has one player on board. He recently returned to campus. We actually saw him at Penn State's latest practice, but they also are engaged with other passers. Tyler Calvaruso is going to give us the latest on what we need to know about Penn State quarterbacks in this 2026 class. Additionally, more top prospects making the trip to campus this weekend. Penn State will host a practice on Saturday. They'll get a chance to be around a bunch of recruits there on the sideline, and Tyler Calvaruso will give us some of the names you need to know. He's been doing a great job covering it over at lions247.com. But now we're going to bring in Daniel Gallen, who joined me on the practice field, and we'll do again next week, and we'll get a weekly look at this team. It's always really compelling because we go months without getting to look at this group. You have about 30 guys move on. You have about 30 guys join the roster. And then you try to see how it all gets sorted out in the field with new position coaches, new coordinators. And Daniel, it's part of the job. We put the pieces together as best we can over at lions247.com. And I thought here on this episode, we dive into some of those bigger takeaways from our latest trip to the practice field. Thanks for hopping on with us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me this afternoon, Tyler.
Probably got to lead with a development regarding player availability. We got kind of prefaced by James Franklin heading into spring ball last week that guys like Anthony Donko, Andrew Rapplier, guys recovering from injuries they suffered last year, were not going to be available to start spring ball. He included Tony Rojas in that conversation. We haven't seen Rojas to this point, but a couple notable names have been added to the unavailability report right now, Daniel, because James Franklin said, for now, he didn't say it was a long-term thing, but he said in this moment, both offensive tackle Nolan Rucci and defensive end Dennis Sutton, two guys that were standouts during the playoff run for Penn State last winter, are not available. We'll talk about what that means from the position standpoint, maybe who's going to benefit from some extra reps on the practice field here in April. But Daniel, your initial reaction to Rucci and Dennis Sutton, James didn't give us a very long answer on that, but it clears things up just a little bit because those were two guys that were notably absent when we got to spend about 40 minutes on the field last week and about 30 minutes on the field this week.
Yeah, I think at this time of year, your antennae is up about who's out there, who isn't. Of course, these guys played a really long season, and we don't necessarily know what they were playing through over the course of the year. We know that Penn State likes to keep things close to the vest. We don't have injury reports with any specificity available to us, and so things can pop up here or there. I do think that when you talk about this time of year, when spring practice starts and someone isn't available, I mean, that's not necessarily as concerning as, say, someone who is available when spring practice starts and then isn't when it ends. I think that
Keon Wiley last year. Keon Wiley was on the field our first couple looks. He wasn't again. He wasn't back on the field until December. Great point, Daniel. If your guys are missing at the start and we don't see him, that's one thing. If we see guys and all of a sudden they pop up and, where'd they go? That's more of alarming.
Yeah, I think that's what gets on my radar a little bit more. I think for individually in those two cases, Dennis Sutton, like, he was someone who was probably going to get a little bit of veteran treatment anyway. When you think about what he has accomplished, what he has done, he was playing at a really high level at the end of last year. He's one of those guys that, like, you know what you're going to get. He knows how to go about things. He knows how this works. Obviously, with Jim Knowles coming in and having a new defensive system, that's maybe a little bit more of a wrinkle in terms of, why or how you would want him out there. But that's one of those cases where it doesn't necessarily alarm me or anything like that. Rucci is a little bit different because he closed the year playing so well. and that you looked at the spring and were kind of like, okay, he can really make this, a conversation or a competition when it comes to him and Anthony Donka, when or if Donka is ready this spring or summer or, whenever that might be from his injury. And so I think Rucci is someone that you would like to get a lot more reps and see how he can build off of how that season ended. But at the same time, like, he's a fifth-year senior. He was at Wisconsin for 3 years. This is the second year at Penn State. There's the same offensive line coach, same offensive coordinator. Not much is changing on that side of the ball. And so you would assume that he knows what he's in for, he knows what he's doing, and that Penn State pretty much knows what they have in him. So I think that's kind of how I would look at it, for those two individually. And then I'm sure we'll extrapolate it out that this also creates some opportunities for some other younger players to get their feet wet and maybe make an impression.
Talk about some of those guys right now. I want to reiterate what we reiterated on Tuesday evening with our practice notes at lions247.com on the message board. We've heard absolutely nothing to suggest for Denai or for Nolan that this is a long-term issue or anything that we need to be concerned about when you talk about the 2025 season. I remember a couple of years ago, Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, they didn't play a single snap in spring ball. They ended up being a fantastic tight end duo come season. They were very healthy come preseason practice. So we'll keep tabs on this. But as you mentioned, Daniel, and as I talked about and teased a bit in the intro, we've gotten to see, and the Penn State staff, more importantly, has gotten to see some other guys getting extra large workloads, maybe more than they would have otherwise. And at tackle, and I had my eyes on offense, just to be candid with everybody, I was watching offense. Daniel was watching defense during our practice look on Tuesday. So it was, again, for the second consecutive practice, Javen Williams as the initial right tackle up with that starting group of offensive linemen. We saw Javen Williams play left tackle as a true freshman in 3 different games while preserving his red shirt back in 2023. Last year, we saw Javen Williams get involved, I believe, 6 or 7 games, some at guard, some at tackle. That was the case at practice. You weren't really sure where number 74 will be lined up when we went out to practice. Could be on the interior, could be on the perimeter. Right now, though, James Franklin told us the concentration is obviously on getting him work at tackle with Rucci and with Donko unavailable. He says if both those guys were present on the field, Javen Williams would be cross-training. He'd be competing for a job at guard. He'd be also playing tackle. Remember, this is a 5-star recruit, came to campus in 2023. He was a record-setting shot put champion on the track and field circuit. But more importantly, from Penn State's perspective, he was an absolute bully in the trenches for Wyomissing High School. Played largely guard, did play a bit of tackle in high school, but I think James Franklin joked that team threw the ball maybe 5 times over the course of the last 3 seasons he was there. I think it was a few more passes than that, but they were super run heavy. And what we saw from Javen Williams over the course of his highlight reel and what helped make him a 5-star recruit was watching him out in open space, clearing paths, and then moving forward to the second and third levels in front of his running backs as a pulling guard often. He's the man getting the bulk of work there. Behind him, you've got Garrett Sexton, who came along pretty nicely last year as a true freshman. Didn't really get game experience, but he's getting some work that he otherwise probably wouldn't have gotten with that second team. And so this is somebody that in Javen Williams that James Franklin told us has a very bright future for us. It's hard to find his pathway toward the starting lineup when you figure that day by day, Rucci and Donko are getting closer to their return. I think we've really well documented what's going on in the interior of this offensive line, where you've got 4 guys with starting experience in the power conference level. You've got young burgeoning talent there. That can include Javen Williams. But for the moment, Daniel, it looks like Williams is going to come out of his 3rd spring practice schedule with Penn State as a redshirt sophomore, arguably getting up there in the most snaps of anybody on this offensive line, really across the roster because of the way he's going to be fed opportunities there with that Donko and Rucci. And I'm really curious maybe what this means for his projection moving forward, because he's a guy, I think when you start to talk about year 3 at the college level for a former 5-star, you're starting to anticipate that there's going to be a step forward. And to this point, Javen Williams has been more discussed as a backup, kind of a supplemental piece for this offensive line, but a little bit more of a spotlight moment for him. And you know that Phil Troutwine is taking advantage of those reps day by day when they get into the meeting room and watch that film.
Definitely. I think Javen Williams could end up being a pretty big winner by the time we get to the blue-white game in terms of being able to bank these reps and really move forward. I know that this is a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison given where they are in their careers, but I always think back to, I believe it was spring 2023 or maybe spring 2022 where Olu Fashanu was really I think Franklin said he was the only healthy offensive lineman through that entire time. I think it was 2022.
Yeah.
And so he was able to bank all of those reps, and then we saw what
He had
happened.
one start. He had only started the Outback Bowl at that point, right?
Yes.
And so it was like we weren't talking about Olu like we'd eventually talk about Olu yet.
Yes. And so obviously it's very different with Javen Williams and where he is in his career and what's ahead of him. Olu was going to be the left tackle that year. They had him in there, and it was, up to him to really capitalize on that. Williams, like we laid out, you got Donka, you got Rucci, you got a lot of guys in that tackle group right now. But this is something where, if he stays healthy throughout this whole time, you're on the field, you're getting that experience. That's something that can really, really give you confidence. You can clean up some things. And when it gets time in the fall to figure out what the game plan is going to be, maybe who the extra offensive lineman is, or are we going to use a rotation? How are we going to rotate guys? You can put yourself in that mix, in that conversation based on what you do this spring. So I think this is a really important stretch for Javen Williams. I mean, you talk about a former 5-star in his third year on campus, and you expect to see some results. And it's kind of like one of those things where it's like no fault of his own that he is in this position when you look at the depth that they've had both at tackle and guard. Guys like Drew Shelton, he's not going to leave the field. Donka, really put his best foot forward and capitalized on an opportunity he got. And so there's just a lot of moving pieces, a lot of bodies there to really sift through. But yeah, I think this is an interesting development and a nice little storyline to follow this spring for that O-line.
It's probably worth noting Drew Shelton, senior. Nolan Rucci, senior. Venga Ioane, who's been playing alongside him at right guard, senior. JB Nelson, who was the first guy we saw at left guard last week, senior. So there's a lot of spots there. You could see maybe Javen Williams filling as a starter, as a guard or a tackle, and maybe as a redshirt junior. But right now, certainly a valuable piece for Phil Trautwein. A lot to work through with the deep offensive line unit. And this is a guy that we'll be keeping tabs on. Venga Ioane gave us a little bit of a scouting report because, again, they've been working next to each other here through 4 practices. Practice number 5 coming up later here on Thursday. Ioane said the athleticism has always stood out. It's been at an elite level for Javen. We've seen that when he gets out in open space and gets a little bit of a clear path in front of him on the practice field. Venga said the big step here that they're working on is the comfort level and knowing kind of what to anticipate from each other, kind of working off each other. He said that was a really strong point for him and Drew Shelton on the left side last year, even if he isn't going to be playing alongside Javen Williams against Nevada come kickoff of 2025. Still, Venga Ioane thinks that Javen Williams is going to be positioned to lead the spring practice with a lot more confidence because of this experience. Daniel, going over to defensive end without Denai Dennis-Sutton, it was a group that I watched during the first week of practice. You had eyes on them on Tuesday. There's a few second-year players in that group, headlined by Max Granville, who have our attention. Anai White made the transfer over from Texas A&M this winter. He's a former top 100 prospect. And then you get Zariah Fisher back in the fold after he suffered an injury last year, missed his year 6 for him. There's a lot of moving pieces at defensive end. What stood out to you on Tuesday?
Yeah, I think seeing Zariah Fisher and seeing him on the field, he looks ready to go. When you talk about a 6-year guy, he's physically mature. He looks the part of a Big Ten defensive end at this point in his career. And it's sometimes it's a little hard to gauge in these quick bursts. Maybe what that athleticism is. Where he is physically. But I think that he's someone that Penn State is going to need to count on this year to be a contributor, and I think that he's put himself in that position to be there. Max Granville, he on the latest roster update, he was in the high 220s for his weight. He's up in the upper 240s now. He's taken a step forward physically. And then you talk about Malachi Williams and the physical development that he has had. I think that that's really interesting in terms of where can he put himself in this mix, because last year I think he was at 220 pounds for much of the season, up to 250 now. We talked to him in February about what that was like, and he seems to realize that he has an opportunity to work into the rotation to get onto the field a little bit, and he wants to get there. And he's someone that he catches your eye a little bit. I think some of it might be you see that number 20 across the field, and
I told you that, right?
Yeah, it kind of goes to Adisa Isaac, and the way that he moves. But I just think that he's a really long guy, really interesting body type. The one thing that I thought was interesting that I noticed was they're doing these half line drills where they would have the guards and tackles would split up, and then they'd work on some run blocking stuff against on one side of the line against a defensive tackle and a defensive end, and the first defensive end up on one side was Zariah Fisher, and then on the other side, it looked like Max Granville was about to line up, but then Ivan Kamaju got up there first. It's practice. It's this time of the year. It's not even like a full team drill, but it was something that stood out to me because we've heard the feedback on Kamaju and how the staff feels about him, what they think he can be. We heard what Chuck Losey said about him on the record about a month ago at this point. So he's someone that you kind of keep an eye out on. He's listed at 6'3", 244 right now. That 244 is a leap. I forget what he was listed at on signing day, but he's taking to things, and you see him, and there's still room to fill out, still room to grow. But it's just someone to keep in the back of your mind a little bit. And when you talk about the ripple effect of taking Dani Dennis Sutton and his rep share out, bumping up everybody else's reps, creates a little bit more of an opportunity for a true freshman who's here on campus. So that defensive end group is interesting. Like I didn't even mention Jalen Harvey. You mentioned Anai White. Deshaun Burnett is here as a freshman. He reminds me a little bit of Malachi Williams a little bit, where you see the skinny long guy, and then you kind of think, okay, what's he going to look like next year with maybe another 20 or so pounds on him. So it's a fun group to watch. Not having Dani Dennis Sutton out there, it makes the group look a little bit different just because of the type of presence he is physically. But I think that this is a good opportunity for someone like Zariah Fisher to be ready to hit the ground running come fall camp, and maybe for one of these younger guys to put himself in that rotation, because we know that you can roll through these guys, keep them fresh over the course of a game, of a season. You can be really important even if you're just depth.
I mentioned earlier, we're 0 for 2 in practice looks at seeing linebacker Tony Rojas, tight end Andrew Rapplier, both working off of injury issues, recovery mode right now. We also, second time in a row, we did not see linebacker Dakari Nelson, who made the move from safety last season, Alonzo Ford, who was injured late in November at defensive tackle, and then Caleb Artis, who also finished last season injured at defensive tackle. We have some other news and notes and updates in our practice notebooks over at Lions 24/7 for our VIP subscribers. Guys who weren't present this time were on the field last time, and we'll be back out there next week. And so if there are any concerning trends for player availability, we'll be sure to note that, and hopefully we'll have some positive updates for folks as well. Daniel, something that stood out from James Franklin after practice on Tuesday, and then I know you just went through the audio from Terry Smith, who we also got, Penn State's 12th year cornerbacks coach, who's been with Franklin every step of the way here since he got to campus. Davian Collins and Elliott Washington. I know we've been pounding the drum on those two. I think just last episode we were discussing them. Well, now we've got coaches discussing them, and I'm curious what your takeaways were regarding both those players. Washington, a true junior who burned red shirt a couple of years ago, took a step up last year before suffering an injury late in the season. And then you've got Davian Collins, who had a lot of buzz this time last year. And by the end of the season, we started to figure out why. He's a redshirt junior who started his career with Mississippi State.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting things from that group that we got from Terry Smith is maybe a little bit of what the depth chart is going to look like. It sounds like that A.J. Harris, the junior who had a really nice season after transferring in from Georgia last year, and Elliott Washington are going to be the first two up on the outside. Terry Smith, though, called Davian Collins, I think he called him a solid third, and that he's going to play equal reps. With Harris and Washington. And that's something that we've seen them do in the past. Like a couple of years ago when Kalen King was a freshman, he was playing, an amount of reps. When Daquan Hardy was playing on the outside a couple of years ago, Hardy, Dixon, and King would rotate through, and you'd see some different combinations out there. But I thought that was an interesting place to start from, in terms of what this depth chart might look like, and what that first 11 on the defensive side of the ball. I know we still have some questions about where's the fifth defensive back going to come from, who's it going to be, how often will that be, but starting in that secondary, I think we have an idea of the corners that we're going to see on the outside the most. One thing Terry Smith said about Elliott Washington that I thought was interesting was that And something that we talked about was that Terry Smith said that the offseason workout is Washington's forte, that he's someone that, the way that he's built, his background, that's the type of environment where he can thrive. And that's what he did, going 6 for 6 in those winter workouts. James Franklin said that he makes it clear to the coaches that it's not participation trophies, that, you don't have to make sure everyone gets one, or that, you're spreading them out. And so Elliot Washington went out there and did what he needed to do. It was, I think they echoed some of the things that Chuck Losey said about, I think James Franklin used the same language as Losey, calling Washington a high horsepower guy. And then, he's looked at this opportunity and he's really taken advantage of it. Terry Smith got into a little bit of maybe some of the more technique or scheme things that Washington is improving on, in terms of, being a backside corner and pursuing a play to the front side, those sorts of things. And so, I think that Washington has put himself in this position where this spring and beyond, that he's going to be someone that we have eyes on and that we're going to expect to see play a lot of football by the time we get to this fall, given what we know about this cornerback room and their recent history.
I think I've heard that phrase high horsepower used maybe 7 times in covering football. And I think 5 of them have been applied to Elliot Washington in the last 2 or 3 years. Really interesting. Now that is the term that keeps popping up with him. When you had your view of defense, anything else worth passing along here? I know, again, you got a notebook of 1,000 words, breaking things down over at lions247.com for VIP subscribers, but anything worth adding to the conversation before we move over toward everyone's favorite position room?
Yeah, I think one more thing from Terry Smith is that he said that AJ Harris should be an All-American candidate this season. I think that's something that we agree with based off of what we saw last year and what we know about AJ Harris. We didn't see King Mack out there at practice, and we're still trying to get a little bit of an idea of where that fifth defensive back is going to come from. And we saw some interesting alignments with 3 safeties, 3 corners, as Penn State was rolling through some 5 DB stuff during practice. And so that's something that we're definitely going to monitor as things go along.
And we did see King Mack at Pro Day.
Yes. He was out there with a cast, I think on his right hand. I think Mark saw him out at practice on last Tuesday with it on. And so, it's spring. We'll see. We've only heard good things about him and his work ethic and everything else. So, it's kind of it's a physical game. This is the stuff that happens. This is why you bring in someone like King Mack to have depth. This is why you recruit. So we'll see where this goes as things go along.
Again, we'll be back on the practice field next Tuesday. We'll have more notebooks, more photos, more everything for you over at lions247.com. Along with getting face-to-face with James Franklin and Terry Smith after that latest practice, we also spoke with Marques Hagans. And naturally, in year 3 now, and considering the lack of production and some very important moments for that position room, there is a lot of attention right now on Marques Hagans. Daniel, you dropped the story over on lions247.com on Tuesday night, and it's just got a ton of comments from people because there's a lot of opinions about Marques Hagans. Some people are quick to say, why is he still working here? Some people are quick to say he needs more time. And there's not a lot of people in the middle, as it would turn out. But, we have covered this receiver room every step of the way. And in some ways, he had Taylor Stubblefield's leftovers, but he also had some additions to that room his first year. And Malik McClain from Florida State, Dante Cephas, an accomplished wide receiver from the MAC. Neither of those guys really worked out. The one freshman they brought in, Carmelo Taylor, was not with the program a year later. Last year, we didn't see a freshman burn red shirt. Julian Fleming, although he was a key presence in that room as a transfer pickup, there wasn't really a statistical bump for your receiver room. And now your 2 leading receivers are wearing other uniforms. Harrison Wallace down at Ole Miss, Omari Evans out at Washington. Enter Kyron Hudson from USC. Enter Devontae Ross from Troy. And then 3 freshman receivers who have been on the practice field throughout spring as well. And Daniel, we got a lot to work through. So where do you want to start when it comes to Marques Hagans? I think really the story you wrote is a good place to start. His general outlook about this room, turning the page from last year when they didn't have a single reception in the Orange Bowl. And, he spent a little time cursing during the conversation as well. So he's a guy that showing a little passion in that discussion as well.
Yeah, I think the place that you start is that Marques Hagans is well aware of everything that's been said about his room, the way that his room is perceived by the fan base. He said that people are passionate, that it's a little bit different than when he played in terms of the immediate feedback that you can get from people through social media. And he and his players have been working through that, the best way to handle that. He said that this time of year, this is when you can use that stuff as motivation. We heard comments from players last year that implied that they were using some of this outside noise as motivation. But Hagans says that when the season comes around, you got so much going on that it's really time to lock in. But he knows what people are saying. He was asked about the comment that Pat Kraft made in February about how it's not a secret that Penn State needs help at wide receiver, and that could be somewhere that they're looking to for the portal. And Marques Hagans says that he doesn't disagree with that, and that he views it as his job to bring as much talent into the room as he can, that he is going to try to recruit over the players that they have. And then it's the players that are there, it's their job to make sure that doesn't happen. They need to beat out who is coming in. So he wants to see the competition that's in there. Something else that I think was a little bit new in talking to Hagans was a discussion of the type of players that he's looking for in this room. He wants to see guys that are tough as bleep. That is the way that he worded it. The way that he framed it is that you're playing pickup football, you roll the football out, you're in a parking lot, guys want to play tackle, and you don't blink. That you say, okay, let's go. That is the type of player that he wants to have in his room, and he feels like that they're getting there. He was asked directly, like, do you feel like Kyron Hudson fits that bill based on how we've seen Hudson go through some stuff in terms of blocking, how he looks physically. And Hagans said that they feel like they're getting there with those types of guys. And so he wants guys that want to work. He says he doesn't want guys who are gonna bleep and moan. There's if you want to really read into it, you probably can draw some connections towards what he's saying about who is here now and what he wants, and also guys who have left over the past couple of years. You can do that if you'd want. And so it does feel a little bit different. It just felt really honest and pretty candid from him than what we've heard in the past, that he was a little bit more willing, I think, to speak in this manner, to speak freely. And maybe that's because he's in his third year, he's more comfortable. Maybe that's he knows where he is and how he's viewed and what this could mean for him moving forward. I don't know if he would directly tell us why he's talking this way right now, but it felt really noteworthy and really notable coming out of Tuesday night.
If we get to Thanksgiving weekend and folks are feeling the warm and fuzzies about Marques Hagans, that means that Devontae Ross or Kyron Hudson or both have really come through with a big campaign for Penn State to finish out their college career. Kyron Hudson, former starter at USC, former four-star out of the big-time Mater Dei program in Southern California, should not be shying away from the spotlight here. In terms of Devontae Ross, it's a big jump up for him from Troy, but we saw him on a Big Ten field last year out of Iowa, score 3 touchdowns, go over 100 yards receiving, and take a punt back to the end zone. So what was the feedback from Hagans on these guys? He obviously had a chance to scout them in the portal and then discuss a lot with them and work on some things in recent months. But now he's 4 practice sessions deep with these two. What were the biggest takeaways from his commentary on them?
Yeah, he didn't get too deep on them. He said that they're guys that are hungry to play football, showing up every day, working hard, which adds well to the group that he has. I asked him specifically about Devontae Ross, going off of what Chuck Losey said last month about, the resources that a Sunbelt school like Troy has compared to what a Big Ten school like Penn State has. And, the big difference there, and how Ross was really embracing that, really taking advantage of it. Hagans said that he's never been to Troy, so he doesn't know, what they have, what they don't have. But, he said that Ross is grateful to be here, works hard, gotten stronger, putting on weight. And Hagans said that he views that as Ross being appreciative of the resources that are there. And then with Hudson, in terms of being asked how Hudson fits into the room, if he's one of the right guys, he says that he's looking for guys that has something that drives them every day to be tough, to not be outworked, and that he sees that in Hudson. so far. So, not a lot in terms of, what are these guys going to be doing on the field? How are they going to be fitting in? But I think that we've talked a lot about the intangible work that probably needed to be done among these wide receivers. And it seems like both Ross and Hudson are adding to that and fitting in well from that perspective.
I know passing along that these guys are working hard isn't going to alleviate a lot of concerns in the receiver room, because you'd expect everybody to be working hard. What else would a coach tell you? But I will say I spent a few minutes after practice chatting with special teams coordinator Justin Lustig, who's in his second year on the job. And his eyes lit up when I asked about Devontae Ross as a punt returner and what he could bring to special teams. He averaged more than 18 yards per return the last 2 years combined. And as I mentioned, took one back to the house at Iowa, what was a phenomenal individual performance, and kept Troy in that matchup for a while last fall. But it'll be interesting. It'll be really interesting to see where this receiver room grows. And look, while he calls what he called Liam Clifford a necessity, essentially, he's that presence. Last year was a lot of Julian Fleming and Liam Clifford were the guys at the front of the room, as leaders. Now it's Liam Clifford, and I think we're trying to figure out who else is going to fill in that kind of a role. But Daniel, when it comes to this room and it actually flourishing, it's got to be some young talent. And that's been a missing component year after year after year. The last few, unfortunately, is you're not seeing first-year players or even second-year players take major steps in your passing attack. And so when we talk about second-year players, Tyseer Denmark is the leader of that pack, because we got a little bit of a longer look at him, but still fewer than 60 snaps in game action last year. He preserved his red shirt. There's also, I feel like, more buzz about this freshman group. Maybe it's because they have 3 guys in the spring practice field. A couple of years ago, they didn't have a single freshman on the spring practice field. But there seems to be more buzz about these guys from a physical standpoint, from a competitive standpoint. And I'll tell you what, I walked off the practice field after seeing Lyric Samuel, Matt Outen, and Kobe Howard in action on Tuesday. And in my head, I thought they had a pretty good day. We were in there for a half hour. They were working in some one-on-one drills. I saw Lyric Samuel go up, grab a ball with one hand in the back of the end zone. Really impressive, showing off his go-go gadget limbs that he possesses. And then also Matthew Outen. I mean, you described it pretty well last week, but he is clearly the most physically put together receiver in that room as a early enrolled freshman, which is pretty scary to think about. But he's also a willing blocker. Got to see him out there in some kind of warfare that they put these guys through. We got some collisions happening, and it was pretty impressive to see him. Tyseer Denmark throwing some blocks around, and Kobe Howard. He was a ball carrier in one of those drills. He got a little bit of daylight, and I saw him in a second gear, and it was a drill that was really confined to a limited space. So to see him reach a second gear of acceleration in that kind of a setting showed me a little bit something for there. So look, I'm putting out a lot of nuggets for you folks if you're trying to grab on any of them for some positivity. But Daniel, it just feels like there's more to work with at the bottom rung when you talk about the age group for this class, that you can kind of flip it. And by the end of this year, it wouldn't surprise me if not that these guys are leading the room, but that some veterans got to stay to the side, because you got to get longer looks at these players if they're showing up on the practice field.
Definitely. I'll start with Kobe Howard because you mentioned him last. But Hagans said that nothing's surprised him about what Howard has done, but it's stuck out just the way that Howard goes about things. That he loves football. He's always getting texts and questions from Howard about different things on the field. He had a lot of praise for the Chaminade Madonna program that produced Howard and put him in this position. And then also going back to what we talked about earlier about the type of player that Marques Hagans is looking for. I think Kobe Howard fits that bill. He said, quote, "He's another guy, like roll the football in the parking lot. You want to play tackle. He don't give a bleep. He's just going to show up and he's going to play." So those are the kinds of guys we're looking for. I think that when you talk about culture, when you talk about what guys can do, I think that's some pretty high praise from Marques Hagans. With Outen, like you said, very physical. And James Franklin and Marques Hagans had some similar feedback on him in terms of, he's raw, because he's a guy that when he was in high school, he did everything. He was listed as an athlete in our 24/7 sports rankings for a while. He was the best player on his team. So he did everything that he needed to do for his team down in Virginia. Now that he's in college, you got to refine a little bit. You got to learn, I think, some of the nuances, some of the technique. So that's going to be interesting to follow, just because he looks like he's ready just from that physical standpoint. But we know that your physical skill can take you a long ways in college.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, it's going to be the little things on the margins that separate you, and that allow you to be a big time playmaker, to make big things happen. So that'll be the interesting developmental curve, I think, for Alton as we move forward.
Tell you what I wonder on Alton, and not really wonder, but I remember Daniel George showing up on campus and instantly being one of the most physically impressive receivers. But he was also a guy in high school, played a few different spots. He wasn't like a wildcat quarterback like Alton, but there were some questions. Is he a safety? Is he definitely a receiver? There's been, where does Alton fit? There's been some questions about that all over the football field. And so I just wonder, your hope is it can click, but I think it's unfair. And I know we've been saying he's a good player and he's showing the campus physically prepared. But to me, Kobe Howard is the freshman. I think if you read between the lines on some of the stuff that James Franklin, in terms of the pecking order right now, who could be ready to play for you against Nevada or by the time you face Oregon at the end of September, I would probably put the money on Kobe Howard, not just because he had a great winter conditioning, but because James Franklin kind of had a contrasting note when discussing both Alton and Howard. He said Howard's been playing receiver essentially since he's been born, and that there is a polish level there that's not often present, or certainly not there with Matt Alton at this stage. So just some things to keep in mind with receivers, a group that we'll be keeping tabs on practice by practice by practice. We'll talk about it here on the podcast again. I'll have a write-up here on Thursday of Hagans breaking down a lot of these individual players. Daniel has one up from Tuesday evening breaking down the vibes around the room and what's kind of ahead of Marques Hagans here in a really spotlighted year 3. Daniel, appreciate the perspective. Nice to share the practice field with you again this week. We'll do it again next week.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right, let's dive into some recruiting conversation right now with fellow Lions 24/7 colleague Tyler Calvaruso. Tyler, good to get you back on the podcast. We never keep you away for a while during the spring because it's a revolving door around here with recruits checking out spring practice. We show up at the practice field. They're already set up there. And as I told you, the future quarterback for Penn State, Troy Hune, was on campus, made a cross-country trip from Southern California. I know you reported that out weeks ahead of time, but when we got a look at him on the practice field, there he was, standing a few yards behind Drew Aller and wearing one of those play call sheets on his arm. Very engaged, very much looking toward his future. A year from now, we expect him to be on this practice field. And so we'll start there, but we have a bigger quarterback conversation to have. Tyler, welcome back. Talk us through Troy Hune's experience on campus during those few days he was in town and ultimately how he left feeling about his commitment.
No, it's been a positive feeling with Troy Hune really the second he committed last summer. And that goes both ways. He's loved everything about Penn State. He's loved everything about the Penn State staff, Danny O'Brien, what Danny O'Brien could do for his development. Those two have become really close. And, Penn State was thrilled to get him on board early in the cycle. And that's just because you're locking down a hell of a quarterback and hell of a potential future building block for your program. Troy Hune's been one of those guys who has gone out and he's done his fair share of peer recruiting. He's helped this class come together. Whether some guys peer recruit publicly, some peer recruit privately, Troy Hune has done his best to try and get some pass catchers to come to State College and join him. And getting him back to campus, I think it was great for all parties involved because obviously if you're Penn State, you want to check in on a guy coming out of his junior season. He's a cross-country guy, so it's not easy to get him out all the time. He's not like a Messiah Mickens or a Kevin Brown. They wake up one morning on a Saturday and say, yeah, spring ball going on. I want to get up to campus, check out practice. Troy Hune doesn't have that luxury. He has to go through a little bit more nuanced of a process to make it out to Happy Valley. He did that. It was a multi-day stay. He was actually around for the Saturday spring practice as well. Arrived in town on Friday while me, you, Daniel, everyone else was out there at Pro Day. So he was getting settled in. Multi-day stay around the staff. Productive for all parties involved. And for me personally, I think it's great to see him engaged and already starting to get a feel for what exactly this Penn State offense entails. Standing there with the wristband, getting a sense for the way the plays get signaled in, getting a sense for the way Danny O'Brien, Andy Kolnicky like to do things. Beneficial experience all around, and it's an experience that can only help him moving forward. It's something he could take back with him to California for his own doing. Say, hey, look, this is how Penn State does things. Maybe we could even make our own operation more efficient than it already is. So just on so many different fronts, I think it was great to get him back to campus.
And someone that young to understand the value of a practice period, I think is big because you have only so many periods in a practice. You only have 15 practices in a spring to try to maximize your roster. And they go at a fast pace. There's not a lot of excuses being thrown around out there. And so if you're a player who's at the high school level, to see that in front of you for multiple practice sessions, especially if a quarterback doesn't know what he's doing, the rest of the offense can't operate on the practice field. So valuable experience there. He's not the only quarterback, though, of course, who was around campus lately. As we discussed on the last episode, Peyton Valzone out of Nazareth High School in Pennsylvania. That's the former high school of Jahan Dotson. He is actually rated higher than Troy Hune. Hune out of Mission Hills in beautiful San Diego County, California, is the number 14 quarterback, number 202 overall in 24/7 Sports rankings. 24/7 Sports has Falzone as the number 11 quarterback, number 177 overall, and he is the number 4 player in Pennsylvania. Both of these guys right around 6'4", 200-plus pounds. Falzone, a pretty high-level athlete. I think there's a little bit of a separation there between the two if I had to gather the evidence on both of them. What do we make of Falzone now that Brian Donis caught up with him again, our national recruiting analyst? Story up at Lions247.com this week. He's got a relatively complicated recruitment brewing right now, and all of a sudden we went from Penn State being on the outside, talking about maybe playing tight end, to Penn State wanting him at quarterback and now trying to get an official visit.
Well, it's the perfect segue from the conversation earlier this week we had about, the way classes come together in this day and age. And, you could really see a lot of these classes become 2 QB classes. It's an ongoing dialogue. You got to make sure everyone involved is comfortable with that plan. And, Falzone, he's definitely different from Troy, and he definitely brings a different skill set to the table. I think that's part of the appeal because both are fits in Penn State's offense with what they like to do, right? Hume's not a statue in the pocket, but he's not as athletic as Falzone. Falzone, we've seen the testing numbers. We've seen the athleticism in person in a camp setting. We know what he can do as an athlete, and he has improved himself as a quarterback throughout this offseason. I think the work he's put in this offseason is a big why the tide has turned a little bit with him specifically. I think, and of course he's working with Brad Mandler, so you get that kind of direct feedback given his familiarity with the Penn State program and the work that he's done with Drew Aller and Ethan Grunkemeyer. Anytime a guy goes out to Ohio and works with Brad Mandler, it's notable. He tends to do a really good job with these guys, and he's done a good job with Falzone. So I think all of that kind of plays a role in the uptick in interest as a QB. And it is a complicated recruitment for him. If you're looking through how he's sorting through which campuses he's going to visit and when, because he's in the middle of a track season. So, and he's a competitor. That's one thing about Peyton Falzone. He's a competitor. He doesn't want to miss practices. He doesn't want to miss meets just to go take visits, even though he's a little bit later to the party than a lot of these 2026 quarterbacks. Because you got to remember, he was committed to Virginia Tech, backed off late fall, early winter. A lot of guys in that 26 quarterback class already locked in with where they're going. And some of those classes are 1 QB classes locked in. They're not really exploring the possibility of adding a second. So it's a different kind of situation for him. I mean, he's going to be back in State College for Elite 11 in May. And, that coincides with a big official visit weekend for Penn State. But that's what was pretty much said. I'm locked in on competing in the Elite 11. Taking an OV, that's not something you do when you're locked in on competing. You focus on one thing at a time. So it's a very interesting official visit schedule that he has coming together. And Penn State's pursuit is interesting as well because, again, we went from one kind of conversation about Falzone to another, and now that conversation centers around him playing quarterback.
Official visit aside, if he shows up to State College High and goes to camp and doesn't check in at the Lash building, that's not a good sign on where things are trending. I mean, we saw last year, Andrew Olish, back when he was trending away from Penn State, he was over their Penn State facilities immediately after he was doing the camp circuit in State College. So we've seen it time and time again, something to track there. I do have a question here, though, for you, Tyler, because it's really a case-by-case basis. I remember talking with Bo Perbula when Drew Aller officially came on board in that 2022 class, and Bo was pretty much like, bring it on. I'm a competitor. Yeah. He's an excellent quarterback. I think I'm an excellent quarterback. Let's get in that room. Let's see how it goes. Obviously, they're going to be in year 4 at the college level. They're both going to be making 7 figures, I think, this year. So it worked out for both of them. Although, ultimately, rarely do you see these guys get to the finish line of their college careers together. Usually one has to make a decision, has to leave. And you're not sure who it's going to be. I go back to the first ever class brought in by James Franklin. They had a blue chipper, Michael O'Connor from IMG Academy. Well, he has a late addition named Trace McSorley, who he flipped from his Vanderbilt class. And that kid ends up being a rock star for you. I think to the 2019 class, Taquan Roberson, Michael Johnson Jr. both come in. Neither of them really develop in the way you would have hoped at that quarterback spot. And so I spoke with Christian Veillere in the 2021 cycle, Tyler, and he made it very clear, I believe it was on this podcast, he had no interest in being part of a 2-quarterback class. He was honest with Kirk Ciarrocca at the time, offensive coordinator, with James Franklin. They knew where he stood. I don't know if that completely shut things down for them looking for a second quarterback, but he was the only quarterback. Where are we with how Falzone feels about it, how Hune feels about it? And I'm not asking you to put words in their mouth. If we don't really know, just say that. But that's a very important part of this, the ego, the competition, how a quarterback sees themselves. Because let's be honest, I know Bo Prabula was out there for some fun packages, but it's usually a one-man job.
Falzone has straight up said competing is what it is. That's going to happen anywhere he goes, whether he's part of 1 QB class, 2 QB class, because at the end of the day, you're going to get to a college, and guess what? You're not going to be the only quarterback in that room. There are going to be other guys in there competing with you, so that's not something phasing him. I don't get the sense it's something that's phasing Troy Hune either. I mean, really from the start, he's another guy who's a competitor. He's not going to back down from a challenge. And again, he committed to Penn State well aware of the lay of the land in the quarterback room. Everyone gushes about Ethan Grunkemeier's future. He knows he's a guy who's probably going to be around. Jackson Smolik, he does his thing. He makes waves behind the scenes in his own right. He's a guy who has, potential to stick around. So it's not a clear path for him, whether it's a QB1 class or, 2 QB class. So I get the sense that he's cut from a similar cloth. These guys aren't going to, run away or fold, or if it's a 2 QB class and decide, hey, look, I want to go elsewhere where I can just be the guy, because I don't get that vibe from either of them. And Falzone has flat out said it himself. So, and that's not even to knock kids who want to be part of a 1 QB class. I think that's a pretty understandable and warranted ask depending on situation. But in this scenario with these two guys, I don't think it's an issue for either.
I'm just going to put this out there because I've seen it happen before. I'm not guaranteeing it happens, but when Peyton Falzone gets to Nike camps or when he gets to the Elite 11, he maybe runs a 40-yard dash, does a little bit of athletic testing, throws the ball around, shows some spins, shows some velocity, has a good day. I think the group of sharks circling around this kid could change.
Yeah,
I know right now it's not necessarily a group you sneeze at. Iowa, Utah, West Virginia, Rutgers. I know Ohio State is kind of in the mix now in some way. But I could see it really going to another level where we're talking about maybe perennial college football playoff contenders trying to pry this kid away from Pennsylvania. Just something to note. I just think that 6 weeks from now, get him to a couple camps, his outlook could look a little bit different. So if you're Penn State, anything you can do to narrow the gap that you might face right now in this moment before you get to that moment, I think is imperative for this staff, and especially if they're serious about getting him on board as the second quarterback in this cycle. Tyler, moving on from the quarterback situation to the weekend ahead, I wanted to close out this episode of the podcast. We've seen Penn State bring visitors to campus every single practice session now. Practice number 5 is going to be Thursday. Let's look ahead to practice number 6, the weekend. More flexibility typically for prospects and their families to be on the move on a Saturday versus a midweek opportunity. So who do we need to know about? Who are you going to be keeping tabs on and probably getting feedback from when they leave campus?
One more quick thing on Falzone, just before we move on, for our listeners who might not know this. I mean, you're 100% right, because the kid just went sub-11 in the 100-meter. So we all know what he can do from a testing numbers perspective that you can quantify. So the potential for what you said, I agree that it very much exists. Now moving on to Saturday's group. It's another solid group coming in. We have a last Saturday, really solid group. We all saw it. Khalil Taylor got back to town, committed. Simon Mickens, come on, spell, got back to town. Lock things down. This weekend, for me, the top guy, I think head and shoulders, given his placement on the board and his talent level, is Matthew Canoe out of Virginia, the priority linebacker target, who has gone on record saying Penn State's his leader. Now, Michigan getting involved, that I don't want to say complicated things anymore, because I think everyone expected Canoe to get that level of offer and be pursued by that level of program. But I think he's given the Wolverines a legitimate look. I'd say they're a contender in this recruitment. But Penn State has pushed a lot of the right buttons here with Matthew Canoe. And I think that's going to continue while he's on campus. He loves Dan Connor. He sees a fit in that Penn State linebacker room. And he's gotten the chance to talk plenty to Jim Knowles. And those two have built up a little bit of relationship. Those two are going to catch up while Canoe's on campus. And they look. We've always talked about Knowles, with his big thing on the recruiting trail, his real value could be when these guys are on campus, because you see his scheme in play and he gets a chance to talk to these guys, maybe even break down some film if the time allows for it. You can't put a price on that in terms of value for Penn State. I should have specified Canoe being, the most important guy on the defensive side of the ball, because Ty Howell's top target on the board for a while now is Max Suter, and he's going to be back in town. Elite tight end prospect out of Illinois, going to be making his spring practice visit. He has an official visit locked in. And I've said it once, I'll say it again. Penn State has the ability to be very, very selective at tight end this cycle, given what it accomplished in the 25 class, signing Andrew Olish, signing Brian Kordovich, signing Matt Henderson. 3 high-quality guys. You could be a little bit more selective now. And Max Suter is the guy you look at as the all-in guy right now. And staff loves his athleticism. He's got that multi-sport background that we have seen Hal covet on the trail time and time again. Good relationships with the staff. I think Penn State has a real chance to pull him out of the Midwest. If all goes well this weekend, that's another step in the right direction before he gets back for his official visit in June. So those are the top 2 guys standing out to me. Those aren't the only 2 to note. Caden Carter, linebacker target from Georgia, picked up his offer during the winter. He's going to be making it up for the first time. Garrett Witherington on the defensive line from Alabama picked up his offer during the winter contact period. Going to be visiting for the first time. Has an official visit locked in. Tavion Branch, we've said it with him consistently. Penn State has a real chance there. He's going to be back in town. So Nick Abrams, top 24/7 linebacker out of McDonough. That's a program where Penn State's always going to have a chance with a guy like that. And Nick Abrams has been quite clear about his thoughts on the program. And then really to round things out, in the 27 class, you've got 2 really strong visitors here. In Cameron Wagner from Illinois, he's an offensive tackle prospect. Again, another elite level guy. And Rashad Streets from North Carolina. He's an edge rusher. And I don't believe he has a ranking just yet. I looked this morning. Maybe that changed with the rankings guys by now. Who knows? But, man, whenever that kid does check in, he's going to be up there. This Penn State staff loves Rashad Streets coming off the edge. They think he's got a high level of potential. They offered during the winter contact period when Deion Barnes is down recruiting in North Carolina. Going to be up this weekend. And, again, the 26 is the focus with this weekend. Last weekend, it was a little bit more 27-centric. This weekend, it's more 26-centric. But if you're going to look ahead to the future, say, hey, look, who could be next in this 27 class? 2 guys Penn State's really high on, and Cam Wagner and Rashad Streets.
Well, this segment was a nice reminder for our listeners and our viewers. I hope that Tyler Calvaruso is on the ball with Penn State recruiting. He is locked in with the latest on the Nittany Lions pursuit of prospects. And if you followed our coverage last weekend, that was apparent. It'll be apparent this weekend. And if you're not following our VIP coverage, you can now 50% off for an entire year behind that paywall over at lions247.com, or $1 for 1 month. You will not regret it. Tyler, great coverage as always. Thanks for hopping on the podcast. We'll catch up with you very soon.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Good stuff from Tyler Calvaruso. Prior to him, Daniel Gallen, 2 of our colleagues at lions247.com. Our crew is ready to get after it again next week, so tune in for a couple more podcasts. We'll be back on the practice field Tuesday. Of course, between now and then, we'll have a ton of coverage over at lions247.com. More stories coming out of spring practices about players who are stepping up at different position rooms, and a lot more from Marques Hagans and Terry Smith at receiver, cornerback. Plenty coming your way at lions247.com. For now, on behalf of the whole crew, I'm Tyler Donahue, stepping aside. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.